Our next speaker is John Topping, the founder and president of the Climate Institute in Washington, D.C., served as editor for portions of the IPCC First Assessment Report, and was recognized for his contribution in the 2007 award of the Nobel Peace Prize to the IPCC. Mr. Topping will talk about recent research highlighting the importance of reducing non-CO2 shorter-lived climate forces and how they can significantly reduce the cause of warming in the near future. Please put your hands together for John Topping.
Thank you very much. Dr. Vaughan's presentation, I think, underscored the urgency of acting, and what I'm going to do here is pick up on something where I want to compliment the World Preservation Foundation and Dods for their prescience, really, in a couple of regards. One of focusing very much on the role of agriculture and food systems, really, in the whole climate issue. This has really tended to be underplayed very much in most of the discussions. And also on recognizing the importance of moving on or shorter-lived greenhouse gases, things other than carbon dioxide. Not that we don't want to move on carbon dioxide, but if we wait and we focus only on carbon dioxide, all the worst things that were projected by Dr. Vaughan on the high end would probably happen. And it's one of the reasons why Micronesia, one of the very vulnerable island countries, has really been very active in the UN in pushing for action on black carbon. I'm grateful to Dr. Michael McCracken, our chief scientist, who also ran the U.S. National Assessment and for 4 years headed the International Association of Meteorology and Atmospheric Sciences, and my colleague, John Michael Cross, for developing some fairly interesting graphics to illustrate the opportunities and the need to act using the business as usual scenario. BAU essentially is what happens if you don't have climate conscious policies, but you assume a certain amount of natural energy efficiency that would happen with the development of the world economy. And as you can see, there are legacy greenhouse emissions, primarily CO2 from the past century. Some would be longer-lived greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide, some chlorofluorocarbons, which still persist even though we've moved aggressively under the Montreal Protocol. There would be rapid increases under business as usual in CO2, but also from methane, which would be associated both with agricultural activity and energy activity, from tropospheric ozone, which is essentially a product of carbon monoxide, methane, hydrocarbons in the presence of NOx, essentially creating something that is dangerous both to human health and to agricultural crops. It's what we tend to think of as smog in urban areas and so on. And then some other greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide and a variety of others here. Black carbon is something that really was ignored largely in the climate debate until the last couple of years. It's probably where we can make the biggest difference in the near term. I mean, this is essentially soot and particles that are a great danger to human health. Because they're only up for a week or two at a time, the tendency was to not factor them in. But the problem is they're constantly replenished. If cook stoves don't change, if the urban transportation doesn't change, if the industrial practices don't change, those particles are replenished readily. And on the other hand, if they do change, you can make a huge difference in radiative forcing very quickly, while also having very positive impacts on human health. We've seen in the climate negotiations in Copenhagen, perhaps to some extent in Cancun, although I hope we'll have a little more success there, that CO2 is a very difficult pollutant to get international agreement on. There was a kind of Alphonse Gaston game between North and South. You go first, you do such and such, and the practical effect is this often results in agreements not happening. There's also a huge inertia within the energy systems and also to some extent within the agricultural systems of the world. In the U.S., interestingly, in the last couple of years, there's been a dramatic drop in CO2 levels from 2007 to 2009, about a 10% per capita drop. Half of that due to changes in the world economy. Other things really due to switching from coal to natural gas, because we have a lot of available natural gas and don't have to worry about the Russians suddenly, pulling it away from us and so forth, as folks in Europe might, and so on. And a variety of other things that are structural change, right? I think U.S. industry is actually more progressive than any of the political parties, and that's, for, a variety of reasons I'll discuss later. But the U.S. election results, just the last day, I think underscore increasingly the urgency of moving on areas such as black carbon and short-lived greenhouse gases, where we have a lot of win-win aspects, both in the U.S. and developing countries and so forth here, that can win over people who might be climate skeptics to actual action, because they breathe and they have to be concerned about air pollution. We have a couple of practical problems with the greenhouse system right now, the trading systems formally. There is in the formal system, 1 ton of methane is equated to 22 tons of CO2. But the practical problem is if we're concerned with the very dangerous things that could be happening soon, that we probably ought to have a much higher valuation for methane. I mean, many of these tipping points are really likely to happen in the lifetime of many of us in this room, not in 2100. And I'll give you a quick illustration here. I mean, the 1 to 22 is really looking at this over a 100-year period. But if we really look at this, look at the equation over a 20-year period, methane, could have a much higher valuation. The reason for that is typically you're talking about 12-year residence in the atmosphere versus much longer terms in carbon dioxide. So in terms of what's driving the changes that would be melting the Greenland ice sheet, that would be causing the positive feedbacks, the metastatic climate change that may be going on in the Arctic, changed albedo, other things that are feeding on itself, this itself is a problem. Now, you'll notice here, this is a chart, prepared, these are, prepared by, partly by the IPCC, by McCracken and Moore and Ramanathan and Carmichael. The areas marked in red are essentially those that are essentially relatively short-lived gases or aerosols. And what's interesting is while carbon dioxide is the most important single constituent driving climate change, it's responsible for less than half. And because it's so persistent in the atmosphere, you aren't going to make a huge dent right away. Even if we could wave a magic wand, we would find carbon dioxide concentrations and stop all emissions would still stay awfully flat, and the radiative forcing would still be very, very large. So this underscores the need to work in some other areas. Now, the fortunate thing about this is most of the other short-term climate forcers are ones where there are huge human health benefits or other win-win aspects. Tropospheric ozone, where we're going to be much more comfortable in our breathing. Methane, the levels have been rising. Last 12 years in the atmosphere, it has roughly half the effect of CO2. But there are a remarkable number of win-win aspects when we talk about reducing methane. Coal miners' safety from draining of methane that would be responsible for explosions, harvesting energy from gas pipeline leaks, from avoiding flaring, landfill methane in the agricultural area, improved animal husbandry, and moving to a more plant-based diet, which would reduce both CO2 and methane basis, and probably doing that primarily on a health basis. I mean, I think there are a certain number of people where the ethical argument will be predominant, but I think the health argument in some ways perhaps resonates even more strongly, and you have a number of people be speaking, I think, on that later. Now, black carbon plays a couple of important roles. It's only up for a short period of time, but it's constantly replenished. It has a warming effect that's roughly 55%, according to the better science on this, I think, is the Ramanathan Carmichael science of CO2, and that doesn't even include calculating the albedo effect, where in the Arctic it plays a much larger role, and in the Himalayas as well. They're potentially impairing water supplies, but it has huge impacts on human health, and that's perhaps the key to being able to get aggressive action on this. Now, the regional effects of this are quite large. The effects really together of black carbon and tropospheric ozone, and to some extent the reduction of the sulfates that happened because of necessary steps we took to address acid rain and so forth. These look like the primary driver for the very, very rapid warming that has been happening recently within the Arctic, and there's a real opportunity to make a difference here. Now, what are the opportunities from aggressive actions on black carbon? Well, perhaps the most immediate would be acute decreases in the Arctic warming, and that's probably the most dangerous single thing that can happen on the planet right now with respect to sea level and with respect to the possibility of climate feedbacks. But it also has the ability to cut down substantially the nearly 2 million lives, about 1.9 million from cook stoves, about 85% women and children, and outdoor air pollution, which kills about another 800,000 worldwide. So this can go ahead aggressively, and at the same time, it yields very sizable climate benefits. Now, this is a chart I gave before that gives you an idea of business as usual and what the breakout is on that. What's interesting is if we assume, for example, a 50% reduction by 2050 across the board, including CO2, and an 80% reduction by the end of the century, this is how things could break out. As you can see, we can make a dent in CO2, and that's important, but we can make a huge dent in the other gases because of the times and so forth there, and especially so with respect to black carbon. Now, this takes us, between now and 2040, lifetime in which many of us, would hope to be around for much of this time. This is really the critical time, I think, for a lot of these tipping points. And the first is business as usual, and then the second is the aggressive reductions. If we do this, we really have a chance of avoiding absolutely catastrophic climate change. At the same time we move on black carbon, it's important that industrial countries have to move aggressively on it as well, because otherwise, the perception will be that we are simply passing off action on CO2 and saying developing countries do all this work. Well, in the industrial countries, one, we can strengthen diesel standards, and we're starting to do that. We can also take off-road vehicles or retrofit some of the older vehicles that don't meet the standards, increase industrial energy recycling cogeneration, which harvests both CO2 and also additional particulates, and then work aggressively through the Arctic Council on these areas. So finally, the last slide I would like to suggest, it's important to get consumer follow-through on this. In Mexico, Crispin Tequel Interactive Network is pulling together a series of climate theaters, like planetariums for climate education. The first of these, there are now 3, there'll be about 11 by the end of the year. The first of these is the state of Puebla. The state of Puebla has become the first state in the world to move aggressively on black carbon, and I think that's important. We need this kind of action. And then finally, I mentioned the UN Global Alliance on Clean Cook Stoves, and that is a practical measure, and we really need to do this. Thank you very much.